ליהודים מאוי סוירו ושמחו וששון ביקור ליהודים מאוי סוירו ושמחו וששון ביקור ליהודים מאוי סוירו ושמחו וששון ביקור ליהודים מאוי סוירו ושמחו וששון ביקור
Hello everyone. As we get closer to Purim, most of the world is going to have that challenge that we already spoke about regarding when do you have the Seudah on Friday. And some will opt for one of the four options, and that is what's called Purim Mapa Umekadesh. They'll start the meal on Purim, it will go into Shabbos with the whole protocol that we already mentioned. The one question I wanted to deal with is, what do you add in the benching? On the one hand, you're benching on Shabbos, so you should say Ritzei, because that's when you're benching. You're benching when it's already dark Friday night. On the other hand, you started the meal on Friday when it was still light outside, and thus, maybe you should add Al Hanisim, because that's when you started the meal. This is an ongoing machlokes. Anytime you start the meal on one day, you go into another day. And with regard to Purim, there basically are three opinions if you do this option called Purim Mapa Umekadesh. You start the meal on Friday and you go into Shabbos. The first opinion is of the Mishnah Brura. He basically says in Simon Tov Reish Tzadik Hey Seif Katan Tedvav that you only say Ritzei, because if you say Al Hanisim and Ritzei is what we call a Tarte de Satre. It's an inner contradiction. If it's Shabbos, it's no longer Purim. And if you say Al Hanisim, it's Purim, it's not Shabbos. And therefore he opts to only say Ritzei. We can basically understand this for a very simple reason. Al Hanisim is an option, not an obligation, but Ritzei is definitely an obligation. And therefore says the Mishnah Brura that ultimately, based on the Chaye Adam, you should only say Ritzei. The second opinion is the Magen Avraham. He brings a Mordechai. I'm not sure if it's the Mordechai, the Chavrusa of the Rosh, that's printed in the back of the Gemaras, or a different Mordechai, that mentions this option of Purim Mapa, and says that you do say Al Hanisim. And he brings the following reason from the Mate Moshe. And the reason is because you didn't daven Ma'ariv yet. But, he says, if you did daven Ma'ariv already, namely in the middle of your meal, you went out to daven Ma'ariv and you came back to continue your meal, then you no longer can say Al Hanisim. And ultimately, that's his opinion, and therefore he says in order to avoid this machlokes, you should basically bench, go to shul, come back, and therefore you wouldn't have this issue. The problem with, of course, that solution is it's not going to be Purim Mapa Umekadesh. It won't be one long meal that starts on Purim and goes into Shabbos if you're going to stop the meal by benching. But that is the opinion of the Magen Avraham, that you could say Al Hanisim as long as you didn't daven Ma'ariv. But it seems like the overwhelming majority opinion is that you can say both. Namely, we can live with this contradiction. We started the meal on Purim, we ended it on Shabbos, so we have to mention both in the benching. This is the opinion of the Meiri that says explicitly you could say it, and he adds in a little knetch, and that is that if you say Al Hanisim on Shushan Purim, namely it's no longer your Purim, but it's Purim in Yerushalayim, it's not a big Aveira, it's not a Hefsek, because it's also a day of celebration. After all, if it wasn't Shabbos, we'd omit Tachanun and Amnatseach, so therefore he says you could say Al Hanisim and you should say Al Hanisim. This, of course, as I mentioned, is the opinion of the Magen Avraham in the name of the Mordechai, and this is also the opinion of the Pri Megadim, both in his Perush called Mishpetzot Zahav, as well as in his Perush called the Eshel Avraham. Ultimately, you don't have to go out to daven Ma'ariv, you don't have to avoid the machlokes, you could say both Ritzei and Al Hanisim. You say Al Hanisim because that's when you started the meal, and you say Ritzei because that's when you ended the meal. And I believe that we can learn from this something very important to our lives, and that is we can live with contradictions. We can be both happy and sad on the same day. We're happy, for example, when hostages get out of captivity, but we're very, very sad and concerned that the price we paid is that terrorists are getting out of jail. Ultimately, we can live with contradictions, and one of the ways it manifests itself is, of course, when we bench on Friday night, if you started the meal on Purim, in which we'll say both Al Hanisim and Ritzeh.